It was close to midnight when Caroline first heard it, the faintest tap against her bedroom window. She lived alone in a small, one-story rental house tucked against a wooded lot. The neighborhood was quiet, the kind where everyone turned in early, and the nights were usually so silent that even the hum of her refrigerator seemed intrusive. She sat upright in bed, her laptop's glow still lingering across her face. The sound wasn't loud, not enough to alarm someone instantly, but it was deliberate, like a fingertip brushing against glass that at first, she dismissed it as branches swaying in the wind. The woods pressed close to her back fence, after all, and she had heard raccoons rummaging through trash cans before. But when the tapping came again, two slow, measured raps this time, her stomach tightened. The blinds were drawn, but she suddenly felt exposed, as if someone were standing only inches away from her, separated by nothing more than a thin pane of glass and some slats of plastic. A subtle chill spread over her skin. Gathering what courage she could, Caroline muted her laptop and held her breath. The room seemed impossibly quiet, the kind of silence where even the sound of her heartbeat seemed intrusive. After a long pause, the tapping resumed, rhythmic now, 3 taps, each spaced apart by several seconds. She pressed her hand to her mouth, resisting the urge to breathe too loudly. Whoever, or whatever, was outside, wanted her to know they were there. She reached for her phone on the nightstand, but froze. What would she even say if she called 911? That someone was tapping on her window? She pictured the dispatcher rolling their eyes or sending a patrol car that would show up long after the sound stopped. Her rational side whispered that it was an animal, but a deeper, more primal instinct told her otherwise. The tapping wasn't random. It was purposeful, patient, and oddly polite, like a guest knocking at a door, waiting to be let in. Summoning a shaky breath, she stood and crept to the window. She placed 2 fingers against the blinds and tilted them open just enough to see. At first, nothing. Just her faint reflection in the dark stretch of trees. But then, her blood ran cold. Against the glass, just inches from her face, a pale hand with unnaturally long fingers rested, as though waiting for her to open the blinds wider. The tapping began again, this time directly where her eyes met the glass. Caroline stumbled backward, her heart hammering against her ribs as though trying to escape. The blinds snapped shut, cutting her off from the hand outside. But the image burned into her mind, skin too white, fingers too long, the way they rested so calmly against the glass, as if the owner had been waiting all night just for her to look. She pressed her back against the opposite wall, clutching her phone tightly, but her trembling thumb hesitated over the screen. Calling the police felt almost ridiculous, yet ignoring what she saw seemed impossible. The tapping resumed. Louder this time, a steady beat that echoed through the room, each knock sharp and deliberate. She whispered a curse under her breath and crept toward her closet, sliding the door open just enough to grab the baseball bat her brother had once given her as a joke about living alone. She gripped it tightly, the wooden handle slick in her sweaty palm. The sound of her own breathing filled her ears, ragged and too loud, like it would give her away. Then silence. The sudden absence of sound was almost worse than the knocking itself. Caroline strained her ears, but all she heard was the distant hum of cicadas outside and the faint ticking of the clock on her wall. Against every instinct, she peeled back the blinds again in a quick, jerky motion. Nothing. No hand. No figure. Only her own wide-eyed reflection staring back at her. She let out a shaky laugh, almost convincing herself she had imagined it all. But then she noticed something. A smear across the glass, faint but visible in the moonlight. A handprint, larger than hers, pressed against the window. Her stomach dropped. It hadn't been her imagination. She dropped the blinds and staggered back, gripping the bat so tightly her knuckles ached. For the first time since moving into the quiet little house, she regretted how isolated it was. No neighbors close enough to hear if she screamed. No one to glance out their window and confirm she wasn't losing her mind. She backed toward her bed, planning to call someone. Anyone, but froze when she heard it. A slow creak from the back of the house. Not at the window this time. From the door. Someone, or something, had moved. Caroline's throat went dry as she realized the knocking had only been to distract her. Whatever had been outside might now be inside. Caroline held her breath, straining to hear past the heavy thud of her heartbeat. The creak had been faint, but unmistakable, like a floorboard shifting under weight. She told herself it could have been the house settling, the wood expanding in the cool night air. But the thought didn't stick. She knew the rhythm of her house. This sound had been deliberate, cautious, almost like a footstep. Her grip on the bat tightened, the wood slick under her sweaty palms. She stared at the door. The cheap wooden frame, painted over too many times by landlords, suddenly seemed fragile, paper-thin. The darkness beyond it pressed inward, heavy and impenetrable. Caroline's mind raced with impossible choices. Should she fling the door open and face whatever was there, or stay put and wait for it to reveal itself? Each second stretched painfully, filling the room with a suffocating tension. Finally, unable to bear the waiting, she crept forward, bat raised, and pressed her ear against the door. Silence. She shifted her weight slightly, and the old floor groaned beneath her. Instantly, she heard it again, a creak, answering hers, just on the other side. Her body went rigid, ice shooting down her spine. Someone was mirroring her movements, standing no more than a few feet away. Her hand trembled as she reached for the knob, but she stopped short. A thin sliver of light leaked under the door from the hallway nightlight she'd left on. And in that light, for the briefest moment, she saw it, a shadow. It stretched unnaturally long against the floorboards, as if the figure standing outside wasn't quite shaped like a person. The outline was distorted, limbs too elongated, the proportions wrong. Caroline staggered back, her throat constricting around a scream she barely swallowed. The doorknob rattled. Not forcefully, not like someone trying to break in, but gently, experimentally, like whoever stood there was testing to see if she had locked it. She stumbled backward until her legs hit the bed frame, nearly collapsing onto the mattress. Her phone buzzed suddenly in her hand, lighting up her face. The sound echoed too loudly in the stillness. And then, just as abruptly as it began, the rattling stopped. The silence that followed was worse than anything yet. Caroline's fingers shook as she gripped the bat, her eyes locked on the doorknob. For several long seconds, it didn't move. The silence felt thick enough to choke her, wrapping around her lungs until she could barely draw breath. Slowly, she reached for her phone again, this time opening the dial screen with trembling hands. She typed 9-1, but froze. If she spoke, if she made a sound, would whoever stood on the other side hear her? Paragraph 2. Suddenly, the rattling stopped. A soft shuffle followed, as if bare feet moved across the hallway floor. The shadow under the door vanished. Caroline stayed frozen, straining to hear, but the house went utterly silent again. Minutes passed, though each second dragged like an eternity. Finally, summoning every ounce of courage she had, she reached forward and locked the doorknob. The faint click echoed louder than she expected, and she immediately regretted the noise. Paragraph 3. She retreated to the window, thinking she might scream for help if she saw anyone on the street. With one quick motion, she yanked open the blinds. At first, there was nothing but the reflection of her own pale face. Then, slowly, a figure leaned into view, right outside, pressed against the glass. A man, or something close to a man, with hollow eyes that seemed to sink too far back into his skull. His mouth was open in a grotesque grin, showing teeth that looked too many, too sharp. Caroline staggered back, her phone slipping from her hand and clattering to the floor. Paragraph 4. The figure didn't move. It just stood there, face nearly flat against the glass, staring into her room with that horrible grin. Caroline's breath caught in her throat. Her rational mind screamed that it wasn't possible, that she had checked the window only moments before and no one had been there. But the truth was undeniable. Something was watching her, deliberately, savoring her fear. She bent down quickly, fumbling for her phone, her fingers numb and clumsy. Paragraph 5. And then, just as she grabbed it, the figure vanished. No footsteps, no movement into the woods. Simply gone. Caroline's chest heaved as she backed toward her bed, gripping the bat in one hand and the phone in the other. She debated calling the police, but some terrible intuition told her they wouldn't find anything. She forced herself to whisper into the empty room, "This isn't real. I'm just tired." But in the silence that followed, she heard it again, a soft tap at the window. The same polite, deliberate knock that had started everything. Caroline's fingers finally obeyed her, punching in the last digit of 911 as the tapping at the window continued. soft, patient, almost mocking. She pressed the phone to her ear, whispering so quietly she wasn't sure her voice even carried. "Please, someone's outside my house," she said, her words tumbling over each other. The dispatcher's calm voice answered, asking for her address, her details, but Caroline's eyes stayed locked on the blinds, terrified that if she blinked, the figure would appear again. As she whispered her address, a faint scrape echoed through the room, like nails dragging lightly against wood. Her blood froze. It wasn't coming from the window this time. The sound came from inside the house, from the far corner of her bedroom, where the shadows pooled deepest. She whipped her head toward it, clutching the bat, but the darkness revealed nothing. Her voice shook as she tried to keep speaking into the phone. "Stay on the line with me," the dispatcher instructed, her voice steady. Caroline nodded, even though she knew the woman couldn't see her. "Units are on the way. Stay where you are." The reassurance should have comforted her, but the words felt thin, meaningless. What good were police minutes away when something was already here? The scratching came again, closer this time, like something shifting along the wall. Caroline pressed herself against her bed frame, phone in one hand, bat in the other. Then, with a sickening realization, she noticed something that made her stomach twist. The blinds over the window had shifted. Just slightly, but enough to leave a thin gap. She hadn't touched them. She would have remembered. And through that gap, a single eye gleamed back at her. Pale, unblinking, watching. Caroline's scream tore out of her before she could stop it, raw and jagged. "He's at the window. He's at the window," she shrieked into the phone. "Stay calm, ma'am. Help is on the way," the dispatcher urged, her voice still frustratingly even. But Caroline could barely hear her over the blood rushing in her ears. The eye blinked slowly, then withdrew from sight. Silence returned. Just when she thought she couldn't take another second, a new sound split the night. The unmistakable creak of her back door opening, followed by the hollow thud of it shutting again. The dispatcher's voice faded into the background as Caroline froze, staring toward the back of the house. The sound of the door shutting had been unmistakable, its hollow echo carrying down the hallway like a death knell. She pressed the phone harder against her ear, her words tumbling out too fast. It's inside the house," she whispered in a panicked rush. The dispatcher's calm tone shifted slightly, urgency creeping in. "Stay where you are. Officers are less than 5 minutes away. Do not engage." But 5 minutes felt like forever. The silence stretched, heavy and brittle, until the soft creak of a floorboard broke it again. This time, it came from the hallway beyond her bedroom door. Caroline's throat tightened. The knob rattled gently, then stopped. She lifted the bat, her whole body trembling, and took a single step back. The faint strip of light beneath the door dimmed suddenly, as if something enormous had blocked it out. "Go away," she shouted, her voice cracking. For a heartbeat, there was no response. Then, 3 knocks on the door. Slow, deliberate, echoing through the small room. The same patient rhythm she had first heard at the window. Her blood went cold. The thing outside wasn't trying to force its way in. It was asking. The handle turned, slowly this time, testing the lock. Caroline stumbled backward, her heel catching on the edge of her rug. She hit the floor hard, the phone tumbling out of her hand, the dispatcher's distant voice still calling out, "Ma'am? Ma'am, are you there?" Caroline scrambled on all fours to grab it, but froze when she heard it. A long, low exhale on the other side of the door. Not a normal breath, but something wet, rasping, almost gurgling. The sound of lungs that had no business working. Her eyes darted to the window. For a split second, she thought about smashing it and climbing out, but before she could move, the door shuddered violently, once, twice, like something slamming against it with unnatural force. Dust shook loose from the frame. Caroline screamed, clutched her bat, and backed into the corner. Then the rattling stopped. The silence that followed was suffocating. And in that awful stillness, she realized the worst thing of all. She could hear footsteps now, slow and dragging, moving away from her room, deeper into the house. The silence didn't last. From somewhere deeper in the house, a floorboard groaned again, followed by the dragging shuffle of feet. Caroline clamped a hand over her mouth, her chest rising and falling in shallow, frantic breaths. She bent low to the floor and crawled toward her phone, the glow of its screen lighting the dark carpet in a shaky rectangle. She pressed it to her ear just in time to hear the dispatcher's voice repeating her name. Caroline whispered hoarsely, "It's inside. Please, hurry. It's inside." The dispatcher's voice shifted to urgent, reassuring tones, promising that help was moments away. But Caroline's attention was locked on the sounds drifting closer, the scrape of something against the wall, a faint tapping on the hallway table, like fingers drumming idly. It moved without haste, as though it knew she had nowhere to go. She tightened her grip on the bat, her knuckles aching. Every nerve in her body screamed for her to run, yet her legs felt like they had been filled with lead. The footsteps stopped just outside the kitchen. Caroline's imagination painted the picture she dared not see. The figure standing there in the half-dark, head tilted, listening. The air itself seemed to grow heavier, pressing against her lungs. She thought of bolting for the front door, but to reach it she'd have to pass the hallway, past it. Instead, she slid into the narrow gap between her bed and the wall, curling herself into the shadows as tightly as she could. For several excruciating minutes, the house was quiet. Then, from the living room, came the unmistakable creak of her couch as if someone had sat down. Caroline's stomach dropped. She imagined the thing lounging there, waiting patiently for her to come out. A shiver raked down her spine as she remembered the grin she'd seen in the window. It wasn't just breaking into her home. It was making itself comfortable. Then, just as her fear peaked, distant red and blue lights flickered through the cracks in her blinds. The wail of sirens swelled as they pulled up outside. Caroline almost cried with relief. "They're here," she whispered into the phone, her voice breaking. The dispatcher confirmed, urging her to stay hidden until officers entered. But before she could even stand, the sound of dragging footsteps started again. Only this time, they were moving back toward her bedroom door. Caroline clutched her phone like a lifeline, tears blurring her vision as the flashing red and blue lights bled through the blinds. She heard the crunch of tires on gravel, then the slam of car doors. A booming voice called out from the front yard, "Police! Announce yourselves!" Relief hit her like a wave, so powerful she nearly sobbed. She stayed crouched, trembling, waiting for the sound of boots on her porch. But before the knock came, the dragging footsteps stopped right outside her bedroom door. The knob didn't turn this time. Instead, silence fell, so complete it pressed against her ears. Caroline's heart pounded, every beat loud enough to betray her. She held her breath, feeling that the thing was standing there, only a thin piece of wood separating them. She almost screamed for the police to break down the door, but her throat locked tight. The officers moved through the house quickly, their heavy boots thumping against the floorboards. "Clear," one called from the living room. Another voice echoed from the kitchen, "Nothing here." Caroline's panic grew as she realized the sounds were moving farther from her, not closer. She tried to shout, but her voice came out as a broken whisper. The dispatcher in her ear urged her to stay calm, reminding her that help was right there. But Caroline knew. They weren't in the same house anymore. Finally, a sharp knock rattled her bedroom door. "Ma'am? Police. Are you in there?" Caroline flinched so hard her head smacked against the wall. She gasped for air, but then the voice came again, steady and reassuring. "It's safe. You can open up." Her shaking hands fumbled with the lock, and she yanked the door open, stumbling into the hallway. Two officers stood there, flashlights cutting through the shadows. She collapsed to her knees with relief. But as one officer crouched to help her up, Caroline's eyes flicked past him, down the hall, toward the front window. In the reflection of the flashing police lights, she saw it again. That same pale face, grinning wide, standing behind the glass as if it had never left. She choked on a sob and pointed, screaming, "There! It's right there!" Both officers swung their flashlights, but the window was empty. Just glass, just shadows, just the distorted reflection of the lights outside. Caroline clung to the officer's arm, pointing with a trembling hand toward the window. Her voice cracked as she repeated, "It was there. I swear it was right there." The taller officer exchanged a quick glance with his partner, his expression tight. "Let's sweep the perimeter again," he muttered, and the two men moved cautiously down the hall, flashlights cutting sharp beams through the gloom. Caroline followed a step behind, her every nerve screaming not to be alone. They moved into the living room. The couch sat askew, one cushion pressed down as though someone had been sitting there moments before. One officer bent to examine it, his gloved hand brushing over the fabric. Still warm, he muttered under his breath. Caroline's stomach twisted. The dispatcher's words echoed in her mind. Stay calm. Help is on the way. But help was here, and the thing had not left. From the kitchen came a sudden crash, a plate shattering on tile. All three of them whipped their heads toward the sound. The shorter officer took the lead, flashlight raised, his hand hovering near his holster. Caroline hung back, the bat still clutched tight. The kitchen was empty when they entered, but the shards of a broken plate lay scattered across the floor. The officer crouched, frowning. No sign of anyone. No open doors, no windows. His words didn't ease the chill that gripped Caroline's spine. Then came the laugh. Low, guttural, and wrong. It rolled through the house, vibrating in the walls, echoing in a way that didn't belong to human lungs. Caroline slapped her hands over her ears, dropping the bat as her knees buckled. Both officers stiffened, their flashlights jerking wildly across the room. Who's there? The taller one barked, his voice cracking despite his training. The laugh faded into silence, leaving the house impossibly still. The officers drew their weapons now, no longer treating this as a false alarm. One barked into his radio, calling for backup, while the other kept his gun trained on the hallway. Caroline cowered against the wall, her body trembling so violently she thought her bones might snap. She lifted her eyes, just once, toward the darkened ceiling. And that's when she saw it. The pale, grinning face staring down at her from the crawlspace vent above, upside down, its teeth gleaming in the beam of a flashlight. The officers froze, their flashlights locking onto the crawlspace vent where the pale face grinned down. One of them shouted, "Show yourself," his weapon trained upward, but the thing only blinked slowly, unnervingly calm. Then, with a sound like a spider scuttling, it slid back into the darkness of the vent. Caroline's scream tore through the room as both men yanked her to her feet. "We're getting you out of here," one barked. Though his voice shook with fear, they half-dragged her toward the front door, flashlights jerking wildly across the walls as if expecting the figure to lunge from the shadows. Just as they reached the entryway, every light in the house blazed on at once. The sudden brightness was blinding, a violent contrast after the suffocating dark. Caroline stumbled, shielding her eyes, her ears ringing with the hum of electricity. The officers froze. No one had touched a switch. When her vision cleared, Caroline saw it again, standing at the far end of the hallway. Not in shadow this time, but under the harsh yellow glare of the ceiling light. Its body was tall, too tall, its limbs impossibly thin, joints bent at wrong angles. The grin stretched ear to ear, eyes black and endless. It tilted its head, watching them with childlike curiosity. And then, slowly, it raised one long hand and tapped its fingers gently against the wall. That same polite, deliberate rhythm. Knock, knock, knock. The officers fired. Gunshots thundered through the house, deafening in the enclosed space. Plaster exploded from the walls, wood splintered, but the figure didn't move. It only stood there, grinning, as though the bullets passed straight through. Caroline's knees buckled, her body convulsing with sobs. Then, with a sudden flicker, the lights went out again, plunging them into absolute darkness. The tapping stopped. The silence that followed was so deep it felt like a void. When backup arrived minutes later, they found Caroline and the two officers huddled outside on the lawn, shaking, their eyes wild with terror. The house was searched from top to bottom, crawl spaces, attic, every locked cabinet and drawer. No one was found. But on the glass of Caroline's bedroom window, still faintly visible under the glare of flashlights, was a pale, oversized handprint, larger than any human's, pressed firmly into the glass, as though it had been watching all along. Caroline never returned to that house. To this day, she swears she still hears tapping at her window on sleepless nights, soft, patient, deliberate.